It was 6:17 a.m. when my phone rang. I was standing in the kitchen, still half asleep, holding a chipped mug of black coffee with one hand and staring into the empty refrigerator like it owed me something. The morning was quiet, too quiet. That kind of silence that presses into your chest when you know something's about to break. I answered without looking. I already knew who it was. His voice came sharp, cold, almost bored. I've cut off all the cards. Debit, credit, everything. You'll figure something out, I'm sure. Have a nice life. Click. That was it. No greeting. No goodbye. No room for response. Just the same smug tone he used in court when he said, "Irreconcilable differences." For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, my hand still holding the phone to my ear. Long after the call had ended, the silence returned. Heavier this time. I could hear the hum of the old refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, and my own heartbeat slow. Hollow. Like footsteps in an abandoned house. I opened the banking app on my phone with a sinking feeling already curling in my stomach. Zero. Savings zero. Joint account gone. I wasn't even listed anymore. I refreshed it, as if some miracle glitch had wiped the numbers off the screen. But the truth stayed right there, staring back at me in bold black letters. He didn't just cut off the cards. He wiped me clean. It shouldn't have shocked me. Not after everything. But it did. It hit like a slap in the dark. Cruel and calculated. I dropped into the chair by the window and stared out at the street. Leaves were beginning to fall, drifting lazily onto the sidewalk. October in Connecticut. Crisp air. Golden trees. Halloween decorations popping up on front lawns. I used to love this time of year. The scent of cinnamon. Pumpkinpie. Fireplace smoke. But now it all felt distant. Like someone else's life playing on a screen behind glass. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around me. Not from the cold. From something else. Something harder to name. Grief? Maybe. Shame? Absolutely. But more than anything else, rage. Because that man, the man I gave 21 years of my life to, just discarded me like old receipts. And this wasn't just about money. It never is. It was about control. Power. Erasure. He wanted to remind me who won. I had given up a promising career in finance when we married. He had this dream of becoming a pilot. "I want to fly planes," he said, eyes gleaming like a boy looking up at the sky. So I stayed grounded. Took care of everything else. Budgeting. Our home. Bills. Meals. Family planning. His schooling. His first flights. I was his runway. And now I was nothing but a closed account. I couldn't even pay the gas bill. The lights would be out in a week. I had $37 in cash in my purse and 3 cans of soup in the pantry. No income. No safety net. No one to call. He made sure of that. The last words he said still echoed in my mind. "You'll figure something out." Oh, I would. But not the way he expected. That morning, I cried. I won't pretend to be stronger than I was. I sobbed into that chipped coffee mug. Let every drop of humiliation and despair pour out. I cried for the years I gave. I cried for the woman I used to be. I cried for the freezer full of his favorite meals I used to make. The birthday parties I planned. The nights I stayed up, helping him rehearse flight safety announcements, just to calm his nerves. And then, somewhere between that second cup of coffee and my final tear, I stopped. I sat there for a long time. Then I wiped my face, took a deep breath, and whispered, like a promise to myself, no more. This wasn't going to be my ending. Not here. Not like this. He thought he cut me off. What he didn't know was I was just getting started. I wasn't always this version of myself sitting in a half-empty kitchen. wondering how to make $37 stretch until something gave. No. There was a time I was the one people came to for answers. The woman with the crisp suit. The sharp instincts. The voice that made people listen. I had a future once. Not just dreams, plans. I graduated summa cum laude from Wharton. Got hired straight into a private wealth firm in Manhattan. My first year there, I brought in over $6 million in new client assets. By 28, I was on track to become VP. That version of me. She didn't cry into coffee mugs or wait for the lights to go out. She walked into rooms with her head high and left with contracts signed. Then I met him. It was a Thursday. I remember because I'd just closed my biggest account and stopped by a bar with some colleagues to celebrate. He was there in his flight school jacket. Loud and charming. Telling some story about almost landing in the wrong state during a practice run. I laughed. He noticed. He told me I had the kind of eyes you didn't forget. I told him he had the kind of confidence that made trouble. He asked me what I did. I told him. He said, "That sounds exhausting. Don't you want something simpler someday?" I didn't. Not then. But he made simple sound beautiful. 2 years later, I said goodbye to Wall Street. He wanted to finish flight school in Florida. Said the program there was cheaper. Faster. More flexible. I cashed out my bonus and moved with him. I figured I'd work remote for a while. Take a break. Maybe start a family. But it never went that way. First it was, I need help with bills while I get certified. Then, this job's just temporary until I can get a real route. Then it became habit. I became the caretaker, the supporter, the background, and to be honest, for a while I didn't mind. He had this way of making me feel needed, and I thought that was love. We got married in a tiny ceremony on the beach. Just us. A few friends. And the ocean. He didn't want anything big, said it was too expensive. I thought that meant he was practical. Now I think he just didn't want to give too much back. He got his license. I got a part-time job doing bookkeeping for a local bakery. We bought a house with my savings. Though it was always ours when we talked about it. I managed the mortgage. I kept our credit clean. I cooked. I cleaned. I reminded him to call his mother. He flew around the country and came home tired. I stayed grounded and made things smooth for him. He started rising in the airline. First officer. Then captain. I was proud of him. I told everyone. My husband flies 737 seconds. He's really good. No one asked what I did anymore. And I stopped offering an answer. Looking back, I don't know when exactly the resentment started. Maybe it was the third Thanksgiving he missed. Maybe it was when I found a receipt for diamond earrings in his luggage, and he said they were a raffle prize. Maybe it was the way he talked to me in front of his colleagues like I was just the wife. A sweet little footnote to his life story. But I know when it all broke. Her name was Savannah. A flight attendant. 29. Bright smile. Instagram full of sunsets and champagne flutes in first class. He didn't even try to deny it when I found the messages. Just said, "It's complicated." Like our marriage was a lease he was ready to walk away from. The divorce papers came fast. Too fast. I wasn't ready. I didn't even have a lawyer. I trusted him to be fair. I know. That sounds stupid now. But I did. I thought he'd at least leave me with something. The house. A settlement. Anything. But he'd already started shifting assets before I even filed my response. Sold the house. Closed accounts. Claimed I had no income and didn't contribute. Said I was emotionally unstable and financially dependent. And the judge, he believed it. Or maybe he just didn't care. I walked out with a few boxes of clothes and a used car. He kept the rest. Even the dog. I wish I could tell you I left that courtroom full of fury. I didn't. I left numb. I moved into a rental studio with stained carpet and neighbors who fought through the walls. I picked up temp work, waited for something, anything to feel real again. But this morning changed everything. He thought he was hurting me. And he did. But he also did something else. He woke up the woman I buried. Not the wife. Not the helper. Not the discarded ex. The strategist. The fighter. He cut off the cards, then I'd find a way to cut deeper. Smarter. Permanent. Because while he was busy flying high and playing house with a younger woman, he forgot the one thing I never gave up. I still knew how to read numbers. And now I was ready to do the math. I thought I had already lost everything. But betrayal has layers. And each one cuts deeper than the last. It started with the house. The one we bought together. I still remember the first time we walked through it, me with a clipboard. Him with that boyish grin, like he'd already imagined his pilot plaques on the hallway wall. I picked the paint colors. He picked the garage tools. We planted a cherry tree out front. Even though we both knew it wouldn't bloom for years. We said it was symbolic. Turns out, it was. He sold it without telling me. Said the house was in his name only. Which I didn't believe until I checked the records. Somehow, months before the divorce, he'd transferred the deed. Quietly. Efficiently. Just like he did everything when it came to money. He knew I'd never think to double-check the paperwork. The day I drove by and saw the for sale sign already flipped to sold, I sat in the car for half an hour, just staring. A young couple was standing on the porch, her belly round with a baby. Him fumbling with keys. They looked so happy. Like we used to look. I didn't cry. I didn't honk. I just backed out and drove away. Then came the car. Mine had always been the older one. A modest Honda that got me where I needed to go. Nothing flashy. But after the divorce, it just happened to break down. Transmission gone. Mechanic said it'd cost more to fix than it was worth. I knew the game. He'd used it as collateral for a short-term loan and never paid it off. I wasn't listed as an owner anymore. Just another thing quietly slipped from under me. He even took the airline points. The ones we used for vacations. Family visits. Even my mother's funeral flight. Wiped clean. Password changed. I started to feel like I was erasing. And then came the final blow. One morning, a manila envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside were pictures. Not digital. Real prints. Glossy. Intentional. Him and Savannah. On a yacht. On a beach in Mykonos. In first class. Clinking glasses with that smug, we won smile. But it wasn't just the pictures. It was the note. Typed. Cold. She's everything you never were. Beautiful. Supportive. And she doesn't whine. Let this be the last time you try to contact me. I didn't remember contacting him. But I remembered rage. It settled into my bones, like lead. He wasn't just moving on. He was dancing on the ashes. And part of me, God forgive me, wanted to disappear. Just dissolve into nothing. Like he clearly thought I already had. But something else stirred. A whisper. No louder than a breath. Fight. I didn't want revenge. Not in the way people think. I didn't want to break him or humiliate him or beg for scraps. I wanted to matter again. I wanted to take back the narrative. I wanted to be seen. So I started digging. Not into his life, into mine. Who I used to be. I pulled my old hard drive from the storage unit and booted up a laptop I hadn't touched in over a decade. It still worked. Like a dusty time capsule. It flickered awake with folders of client reports, spreadsheets, and notes from my days in finance. Muscle memory returned fast. Balance sheets. Equity growth. IPO cycles. I still had it. It was buried under years of grocery lists and dry cleaning and what time will you be home, but it was there. I started small. Just reading industry news. following airline market shifts, watching executive reshuffles at major carriers. His airline had been in headlines lately. Something about internal restructuring. Speculation of going public. That caught my eye. Because going public meant paperwork. It meant filings. It meant vulnerabilities. I remembered something a managing partner once told me in New York. We were talking about hostile takeovers. And he said, "The quiet money is always the most dangerous. Because by the time you realize it's there, it already owns you." And just like that, a seed was planted. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know when. But I was going to become the quiet money. I was going to own the very sky he thought he ruled. The best part, he'd never see it coming. Because men like him, they never look back. They never imagine the woman they buried as the one already drawing the map. He took everything from me. But he forgot one thing. I still had my mind. And I was about to use it. The next few days passed in a blur of thoughts and questions. I couldn't sleep more than a couple hours at a time. I'd wake up with a jolt. Heart pounding. Like I'd been dropped into the middle of something I wasn't ready for. But I was ready. I just didn't know where to start. Every morning, I sat at the tiny table in my rented studio, staring at my laptop. My old self, the woman in the tailored blazer and heels, she would have known what to do. She would have made a list, drawn a chart, picked up the phone and made the world move. But I'd been out of the game too long. I wasn't even sure what game I was playing. One night, I found myself staring at a picture I kept in the back of my drawer. It was from a gala back in 2004. I was on the stage, accepting an award for Emerging Financial Strategist of the Year. My hair was pinned back. My smile was fierce. I looked like I owned the room. He was in the audience that night. I remember how proud he looked. Or maybe I just wanted to remember it that way. Now here I was, eating peanut butter on crackers and counting coins for laundry. What does a woman like me do now? I asked myself that out loud. And then, like it came from somewhere deep in my bones, the answer rose. I investigate. Not out of bitterness. Not even to punish him. But because the only way to get control back is to know what you're dealing with. He worked for a mid-sized regional airline. Not one of the majors, but big enough to have union fights, MAGA rumors, and boardroom drama. A company like that wasn't just flying planes, they were flying on debt, negotiations, and ambition. I started by reading everything I could find. SEC filings, industry forums, whisper articles in trade publications. At first, it was like reading a foreign language. I'd been gone too long. But then the rhythm came back. The airline was positioning itself for an IPO, initial public offering. That meant they were trying to go public, raise money through outside investors, clean up their books, and present a shiny version of themselves to Wall Street. But IPOs are messy. They leave trails, and messes are where truth lives. I started digging through the numbers, what they were disclosing, what they weren't. And something caught my eye. A sudden reshuffling in the executive branch. CFO gone. VP of Operations listed as on leave. A drop in pilot retention rates. High operating costs, with no clear breakdown. It was all buried in dry, clinical language. But I could read between the lines. Something wasn't right. That's when I remembered his stories. The ones he'd tell over dinner. Not the romantic ones. The ones he told when he'd had 2 glasses of wine and thought I wasn't really listening. Stories about fudging flight hours to qualify for bonuses. About pilots logging training hours as active time. About under-the-table deals with vendors for favorable contracts. At the time, I laughed it off. I thought it was just locker room bravado. But now I wondered if those offhand remarks were pieces of something bigger. I started keeping a notebook. Dates, names, incidents, comments he'd made over the years. I mapped them out like puzzle pieces, and slowly, A picture began to form. He wasn't just part of the company. He was part of its rot. I knew then I wasn't just going to sit back and move on. I was going to find a way in, but how a direct buy-in was impossible. I didn't have the cash. But corporations don't always look like people. They hide behind shell companies, investment groups, proxies, and I knew how to build one. So I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Marjorie Lane. Back in the day, she was the queen of client acquisitions, ran her own boutique firm, focused on women-led capital ventures. She always had one rule: don't waste her time. I sent her a message. Nothing dramatic. Just one line, Marjorie. I have a situation. One that could flip an airline. You in. She responded within 10 minutes. Meet me Friday. 9 a.m. Don't be late. So I booked a bus to D.C. and packed my old portfolio. It was time to stop grieving. Time to start building. The question was no longer what do I do, it was how far am I willing to go to get my life back, and the answer was simple. All the way. Marjorie hadn't changed much. Still wore her hair in that severe bun. Still walked like the floor belonged to her. Still ordered espresso with no sugar and didn't smile unless she meant it. We met at a Kiat cafe near DuPont Circle. She had the corner table already claimed by the time I walked in. She glanced up, scanned me in 2 seconds flat, and motioned for me to sit. Didn't expect to hear from you, she said, folding her hands. You disappeared. I know, I replied, sliding into the seat. But I'm back. She tilted her head slightly. You look like hell. I smiled. Feels about right. She didn't waste time. So, talk. I opened the portfolio and slid it across the table. Inside were the beginnings of my plan. Printos, notes, connections, market indicators, and a rough outline of what the airline was planning with the IPO. I pointed out the holes in their financial disclosures, the sudden exec departures, and a pattern of cost manipulation I was almost certain tied back to pilot bonuses. Her eyes didn't blink once as she read. She took it all in, then leaned back slowly. And your endgame, I didn't hesitate. Ownership stake. Enough to influence the board. She let out a short breath through her nose. Jesus. Too ambitious. No, she said. Too fun. Marjorie knew people. Real people. Not bankers in suits or brokers at cocktail bars. But the kind who moved money in silence. Women who owned vineyards in Italy. Real estate in Dubai. Silent shares in half the fashion houses in New York. Women who didn't crave the spotlight, they bankrolled it. By the time our coffee turned cold, she had a plan. We'd form a holding company clean. Kiat. Delaware registered. It would exist on paper. Fronted by a managing director we both trusted. We'd funnel money through layered investment firms, each designed to look like nothing more than a mid-size equity group trying to take a bet on a rising airline. To the public, we were just investors. To the board, we were capital, something they desperately needed to get the IPO off the ground. But before I could make a move, I needed more than gut instinct. I needed proof. That meant going deeper. And it meant getting close to people still inside. One name stood out: Marcus. He was a flight scheduler. Quiet. Nervous. Liked to stay under the radar. But he owed me a favor. Back when he was just starting out, his paycheck got held up for 3 weeks. He had a new baby, a sick wife, and a mountain of bills. I remember loaning him $2,000 and never asking for it back. So I reached out. He agreed to meet reluctantly at a small pub near the airport. His eyes darted the whole time, like he expected someone to be watching. I can't talk long, he said, fingers wrapped tight around his glass. If they find out, they won't, I assured him. I'm not looking to burn anyone. I just need to understand what's going on." He hesitated, then leaned in. "There's been pressure from the top. They want us to adjust flight logs, shift training hours, make the numbers look better for the IPO. Pilots are being pushed to fly through fatigue. Maintenance reports are getting buried." "Is he involved?" I asked. Careful not to say my ex-husband's name. Marcus didn't answer right away. Then he nodded. "More than anyone." That confirmation was like a cold wind through my chest. Not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. I thanked him, slipped an envelope into his hand before I left. Not with cash. He wouldn't have taken that. Just a prepaid phone, with one number programmed in. "Only if you need it," I said. Back in my hotel room that night, I laid everything out on the bed. Articles, financial statements, org charts, a spreadsheet tracking every executive shift over the last 18 months. This wasn't just a company in transition. It was a company in crisis. And if I played this right, I wouldn't just own shares. I'd own leverage. Real, undeniable leverage. But something in me paused. I stared at his name in the org chart. Still listed as lead captain. One of their most reliable senior pilots. The face of the company's new safety campaign. No less. He had no idea how exposed he really was. I thought about the last time I saw him in person signing the divorce papers. Not even looking at me. Just flipping pages like they were an inconvenience. "You'll be fine," he said. "Women like you always land on your feet." I remember smiling through my teeth and replying, "I don't plan to land. I plan to fly." At the time, I didn't mean it. But now I was building my wings. And I wasn't flying toward him. I was flying over him. I didn't celebrate when the papers came through. The documents arrived in a flat brown envelope. Standard courier. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would raise eyebrows. Inside was a single signature page with a small sticky note attached that read, "Welcome to the table." M. The holding company was officially operational. On paper, it was called Larkspur Equity Clean. Forgettable. And exactly the kind of name you'd find buried in the third row of an investor list. Marjorie had set it up with the precision of a surgeon. The company was capitalized through 4 private investors, 2 of which were her longtime clients. The other 2 shell entities under my name, masked behind legal firewalls. In the public eye, I didn't exist. And that was the point. Our first move was small, strategic. We bought a modest stake through a secondary offering. Just enough to give us a foot in the door. Then came the real play. We offered short-term bridge financing to the airline's board. Right when they needed it most. Cash flow was tight. Fuel prices were up. They were burning reserves faster than projected. And every day they delayed the IPO was another day closer to drowning in debt. They were looking for lifelines. We became one. They welcomed Larkspur like a friend they thought they knew. And because Marjorie was the one in the meetings, all smiles and boardroom polish. No one asked where the money was really coming from. Behind the scenes, I was building my own profile, studying the board members, their histories, their weaknesses. One was in the middle of a divorce, battling for custody. Another had insider trading whispers on his name from a company he left 3 years ago. A third had a pattern of approving risky contracts for construction projects that never fully materialized. None of them were clean, and none of them were watching closely. They were too distracted with saving their own seats. Meanwhile, I kept feeding Marcus burner phones, each with just one directive: gather. Flight logs, payroll inconsistencies, maintenance audit delay. Every email, every spreadsheet, every little lie disguised as routine. And Marcus delivered. He was terrified. But he was thorough. He started leaving envelopes for me in a storage unit we shared the code to. Each one marked with a date and a simple word: clear, dirty, verify. In just 6 weeks, I had built a quiet archive that could make any auditor sweat. But I wasn't ready to use it yet. Not until I had full control. That's when Marjorie called me. "I have news," she said. Voice clipped. "They want you." I froze. "What board seat?" "None voting? For now. They want to keep Larkspur happy. They're offering it as a courtesy. They don't know it's me." "No," she said. "But if you accept, eventually they will." "You okay with that?" I was quiet. Then I said, "Set the meeting." The night before the board session, I stood in front of the mirror longer than I should have. Not out of vanity, but out of reflection. What would they see? Not a scorned ex-wife. Not the woman he used to kiss on the forehead before takeoff. They'd see someone else now. Hijos de Adark Naviswoot. Clean lines. No frills. Pulled my hair back like I used to. Slipped on the same watch I wore the day I walked away from Wall Street. It had stopped working years ago. But I never fixed it. It wasn't about time. It was about memory. The boardroom was on the 18th floor of a glass tower downtown. Polished wood. Leather chairs. Bottled water lined up like soldiers. Marjorie introduced me as Larkspur's strategic advisor. No one blinked. Not yet. They talked numbers, forecasts, IPO readiness. No mention of internal discrepancies. No hint of guilt. Just charts and optimism and corporate buzzwords. I said very little. Just listened. Took notes. Smiled when appropriate. But when they asked if Larkspur would be interested in increasing its stake, I looked up. "Possibly," I said, "if the fundamentals make sense." One of the board members leaned forward. "And how do you evaluate fundamentals?" I held his gaze. Steady. By looking past the press releases, that line hung in the air a little too long. But they nodded, pretending not to hear the edge in my voice. After the meeting, Marjorie and I stood in the elevator alone. "You good?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "They're not ready for me," I said. She grinned. "No, they're not." Back in the hotel room that night, I opened the latest envelope from Marcus. Inside was a flight log, flagged in yellow. The signature at the bottom was his. My ex-husband. It showed him logging hours he hadn't flown. It wasn't the first. And it wouldn't be the last. I closed the folder and whispered to no one, "Now we wait." Because power doesn't come from striking first. It comes from knowing exactly where to strike and how deep to go when the time is right. For weeks, I stayed in the shadows. The board accepted Larkspur as one of their key strategic investors. That gave me access, just not visibility. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Let them think I was just another quiet investor tucked behind a fancy name and a faceless signature. Let them keep talking in circles and pushing numbers that didn't add up. I was counting on their arrogance. The more they underestimated me, the more room I had to maneuver. Still, there's something strange about walking through a building where your ex-husband is a star and no one knows who you really are. The airline's headquarters was a modern maze of glass, chrome, and forced smiles. Every wall was branded with slogans like "We fly with integrity" and "Trust takes flight." Corporate pootery. I wore my ID badge on a lanyard like the rest of them. No one asked questions. I was Larkspur's representative. A woman in neutral heels and a folder full of projections. What they didn't know was that the folder also held evidence. Fake flight hours. Misreported maintenance logs. Pressure from management to cut corners. And threaded through it all his name. Again and again. He'd been careful. But not careful enough. Pilots sign things. Pilots leave footprints. And when your ego is bigger than your sense of risk, you forget the paper trail. I hadn't spoken to him since the day he cut off my cards. That morning, I remember every second. The way he said it so casually, like flicking a cigarette into the wind. You'll figure something out. Now he was flying routes on a license built on lies. And I was sitting just a few floors above him, holding the key to his destruction. But I didn't move yet. I waited. Because exposing a man like him required more than proof. It required timing. He had become a public face for the airline used in ads, interviews, even featured in a glossy in-flight magazine spread. The captain with charm. They called him. The reassuring voice in turbulence. God. I almost laughed when I read it. If only they knew what kind of turbulence he'd caused in real life. But I kept my face straight. Took meetings. Drank lukewarm coffee in glass conference rooms. Nodded while execs pitched innovative growth strategies and revenue optimization models. It was all noise. The only voice I listened for was his. And then, one morning, it came. I was in the cafeteria, standing in line behind a group of flight staff waiting for coffee. And suddenly, I heard that voice. Confident. Familiar. Him. He was behind me. Yeah. They're trying to bring in more investors. But they don't know half the story. It's all smoke and mirrors. He was talking to someone, probably a junior pilot trying to impress him. I turned just slightly. Enough to see him. But not be seen. He hadn't changed much. A little grayer at the temples. Still Ton. Still too polished. Still him. He was laughing at his own joke when his eyes scanned the room and brushed past me. No flicker of recognition. Not even a pause. I was just another woman in line. He'd erased me that completely. And in that moment, I knew exactly what to do. I didn't need revenge, that screamed. I wanted a silence that hit like a hammer. That afternoon, I made a call to a woman named Cora. We'd interned together in college. Both of us trying to survive the boys' club of corporate finance. She now worked in aviation compliance for a regulatory agency. I didn't give her names. Not yet. But I asked about whistleblower protocols. She listened. Carefully. You sitting on something, or building something, both. I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, document everything. Dates. Communications. Who knew what? When. Build it like a case. And don't submit anything until you're ready to go all the way. I already was. That night, I opened the storage unit where Marcus had been leaving the files. He'd been even more thorough than I realized. He'd created a folder called Just in Case. Inside were screenshots of emails, internal memos, notes from meetings, logs that were altered after initial submissions, even voice recordings of managers coaching pilots on what to say if questioned. It wasn't just carelessness. It was fraud. And it wasn't just my ex-husband involved. It was bigger. If I went public, the IPO would implode. Execs would lose their jobs, maybe even face legal consequences. And he'd never fly again. But I didn't move yet, because I wasn't finished collecting. I wasn't finished becoming out. At home that night, I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by papers and highlighters and legal pads. The woman I used to be would have cried at the chaos. The woman I'd become felt calm in it. Because I knew what was coming. They were flying blind. And I was about to bring the storm. The walls of my apartment started to look like a war room. Post-it notes. Printus. Red string. If you can believe it, an old habit from back when I used to map out financial patterns like crime scenes. Because sometimes they were crime scenes. They just wore nicer suits. I didn't eat much. Slept even less. I lived off black coffee and adrenaline. And it was enough. I wasn't tired. I was focused. Because now I had it. The full picture. The fraud wasn't isolated to a few shady hours logged or whispered shortcuts. It was systemic. There were incentives tied to flight hours. Pilots who logged more miles on paper got early bids on premium routes, better bonuses, and priority for promotions. And my ex, he was racking up more hours than humanly possible. The data Marcus pulled showed it clearly. Flights he supposedly piloted back-to-back, on opposite sides of the country. Logs that overlapped with vacation time. Layovers that didn't match records. He wasn't just bending the truth. He was rewriting it. He'd become a symbol for the airline's safety culture, steady hands in uncertain skies. But behind the scenes, he was cashing in on false hours and fueling a system that encouraged others to do the same. And the higher-ups. They weren't just turning a blind eye, they were orchestrating it. I sat on the floor one night, cross-legged, flipping through documents. Each one was another match in a dry field. H Name, H signature, H discrepancy. And it hit me. I wasn't just holding a case against him, I was holding a case against the company. That was when I started recording myself. Not for exposure, for clarity. H night. I sat with a voice recorder and spoke like I was telling my story to someone who would someday ask, "How did you do it?" I needed to remember who I was, how far I'd come, what I was risking, because what I was about to do wasn't safe. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down on me. But I'd made peace with that, because even if I failed, he'd know I stood back up. I called Cora again, told her I was ready. She gave me an email address. Secure. Anonymous. Once you send it, she said, there's no going back. I'm not going back. I replied. I uploaded the files, organized, labeled, time-stamped. I didn't name myself, but I made sure they'd know where to look. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the windows. Even though I lived 6 floors up, my phone buzzed every time a car passed outside. Paranoia crept in. Quiet at first, then loud. Because whistleblowers don't always get applause. Sometimes, they get followed. And 2 nights later, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street. No plates I recognized. Lights off. Engine idling. Then it came back the next night. And the next, I told myself it was nothing. But the next morning, I found my mailbox open. Papers inside. Scattered like someone had gone through them and left in a hurry. My breath caught in my throat. This was the cost. I started getting emails from old friends. Friendly at first. Then strange. One woman I hadn't heard from in years suddenly wanted to grab coffee and catch up. Another, a former neighbor, asked if I was doing okay. Financially. Then Marcus stopped responding. I called twice. Texted once. Nothing. I drove to the storage unit. The code had been changed. That's when I knew they knew. Or at least someone knew enough to make things uncomfortable. I sat in my car and stared at the wheel. For the first time in weeks, my hands shook. What if I'd gone too far? What if they buried it all? What if they came after me next? My mind spiraled. I thought about disappearing. About dropping it all. Leaving the city. Starting fresh. There were places I could go. No one would look for me. I could get a job. Live small. Be safe. But then I thought about that call. The one he made after the divorce. I've cut off the cards. You'll figure it out. I had figured it out. Piece by piece. Alone. I had clawed my way back from nothing. From silence. From being erased. And now I had power. Maybe not the kind you see on headlines, but the kind that scares people. Because I wasn't bluffing. And I wasn't done. I called Marjorie. She picked up on the second ring. They're getting nervous. I said, good. She replied, that means they believe you. But they're sniffing around. Then, hold your nerve. Because they don't know what you're about to do next. I looked out the window. The black sedan was gone. But the fire in my chest, still there, stronger than ever. Because I wasn't running. I was walking straight into the storm I built, head held high, case in hand, and the truth strapped to my back like armor. Let them come. I was ready. I didn't leave my apartment for 2 days. Not out of fear. Out of calculation. I kept the blinds half closed. Phone on silent. And laptop open like a weapon. I reviewed every file I'd sent. Every trail I'd left behind. I wasn't sloppy. I knew that. But paranoia doesn't care about facts. It wraps around your throat and whispers, "What if?" I kept waiting for the call. The knock. The moment everything would explode. But nothing came. Just silence. And silence can feel worse than confrontation. On the third morning, I checked the burner phone I'd given Marcus. Still no message. Not even a ping. That scared me more than anything else. I tried his personal number. Straight to voicemail. I called Marjorie. She was calm. As always. "They're rattled," she said. "That's a good sign." I didn't feel good. I felt hunted. That night, someone followed me. I was walking back from the corner store. A grocery bag in one hand, my keys clenched tight in the other. I felt it first, a shift in the air. Then I heard footsteps. Measured. Slow. I stopped. The steps stopped too. I turned. No one. Or at least no one I could see. I walked faster. Heart racing. Each shadow feeling sharper than the last. I got home and double-locked the door. Slid a chair under the handle like I used to do in college dorms. Then I stood in the middle of my apartment and stared at the walls. Wondering how the hell I got here. And for the first time since this all began, I felt it doubt. Not about what I was doing, but whether I could make it to the end. I was alone. Truly. Finally alone. I had no husband. No family nearby. No one knocking on my door just to ask if I'd eaten. My name was hidden behind shell companies. My closest ally was a woman who operated in whispers and contracts, and Marcus, I didn't even know if he was safe. I sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, and let myself feel it all. The grief, the exhaustion, the fear, the betrayal. I thought about calling him my ex. Not to beg, not to scream, just to ask, why? Why had he turned into this man? Why was hurting me? Never enough. Why did he have to win so completely but I didn't call? Because I already knew the answer. Some men only feel tall when someone else is on their knees. I used to be that person. Not anymore. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I pulled out the last sealed envelope from Marcus's Dropbox. One I hadn't opened yet. It was dated weeks earlier. Inside was a USB drive. I plugged it into my laptop. There were recordings, low-quality audio from a phone in someone's pocket. Most were chatter from flight crew meetings. But one file stood out. It was a conversation. My ex-husband. And someone from upper management. I listened closely. At first, it was technical speak metrics. Staffing issues. Route changes. Then it shifted. As long as no one digs too deep. The voice said, "HR is in on it." My ex replied, "They've been scrubbing the records for months. If anyone tries to look," the audio cut for a second. Then came the punch. "If it gets out, we're looking at jail time. You know that, right?" I stared at the screen. There it was. Plain. Simple. Spoken. They weren't just lying to investors. They were covering up federal crimes. And my ex, he was knee-deep in it. The rage I felt wasn't hot. It was cold. Clean. Surgical. I closed the laptop and stood. Enough waiting. Enough fear. I looked around the apartment, the space where I'd cried. fought, rebuilt. It was time to step out of hiding, to bring this into the light. The next morning, I put on a black blazer. No makeup, no juveleri. Just the drive in my purse and a plan in my pocket. I walked into Marjorie's office just after 9 loose. M. She looked up and smiled faintly. I was wondering when you'd show. I handed her the USB. Get it to the right people. I want them to hear it from me next. She nodded. Then she paused. You're ready to show your face, I nodded. No more curtains. No more proxies. She smiled wider. Then we need to schedule a meeting. With who? The board. She said. You're calling it. That afternoon, I got an email. Board meeting. Wednesday. Mandatory. And below it, the location. I read it twice. Same building. Same floor. Same glass walls where they thought I was nobody. They didn't know what was coming. But they were about to find out. Because the next time I walked through those doors, I wouldn't be hiding behind a holding company. I'd be standing in full view. And I would burn the lies down with my name on every match. Wednesday came gray and heavy. The kind of day where the sky feels like it's holding its breath. I arrived early. Not to make a statement. Not to rattle anyone. I just wanted a moment alone in the room before the walls filled with suits and spin. The boardroom looked exactly as I remembered: glass walls. Polished wood. A long table that always smelled faintly of lemon oil and power. I sat at the head of it. No one told me to. No one needed to. This time, I wasn't waiting for permission. One by one, they came in. Directors. Executives. Legal advisors. They nodded politely, gave the rehearsed smiles. A few gave puzzled glances. I saw one of them lean over to whisper something to another. They hadn't all figured it out yet. But they would. And then he walked in. My ex-husband. Still dressed like the golden boy crisp uniform shirt. Wings pinned to the chest. Aviators tucked into his collar like some tired cliché. He stopped in the doorway when he saw me. I didn't flinch. Not when his mouth tightened. Not when his eyes flicked toward the seat I was in. He took a chair across the table. Didn't speak. Didn't blink. Good. Let him sit in it. The CEO finally entered. Took his place at the far end. Everyone settled. The hum of pre-meeting chatter died down. Then Marjorie stood. She cleared her throat. Placed a leather folder gently on the table. Before we begin, she said, calm and precise. Larkspur Equity would like to formally introduce its founding investor, the woman responsible for the capital that secured your bridge funding, the woman who now holds the largest independent voting bloc in this company. She turned to me, and every head followed. I stood. No note, no screen. Just me. My name is Catherine Walsh. I let the name sit in the air. Some shifted in their chairs. Some squinted, trying to place me. One of them whispered something. Another went pale. I didn't wait. I'm not here to make noise. I'm here to make this company honest. What I've uncovered over the last several months will be submitted to federal authorities by the end of today. Gasps. Papers rustled. One of the legal advisors reached for his phone. I kept going. I have documentation of altered flight logs, falsified maintenance reports, pressure on pilots to fly beyond their limits, and coordinated efforts from top-level management to cover it all up. I turned my eyes directly to him, my ex. Captain Thomas Walsh is at the center of these violations. He opened his mouth to speak. I raised a hand. You'll have time to respond. After I finish, he froze. I pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. Neat. Controlled. Inside is a summary of the evidence. Flight records. Internal memos. Recorded conversations, including one between Captain Walsh and a senior executive. discussing possible jail time. The room went silent. No one even breathed. Then the CEO spoke. His voice brittle. "Ms. Walsh, this is highly irregular. If you had concerns, I had evidence. You ignored it. Or maybe you buried it. Either way, it's too late now." Marjorie stepped forward again. As the majority shareholder representing Larkspur's interest, "We are calling for an immediate vote to remove Captain Walsh from all duties, effective immediately, and to open an internal investigation before the authorities do it for you." It was procedural from there. But no one could pretend it wasn't personal. They voted. One by one. The motion passed unanimously. My ex sat motionless, staring. I think part of him still didn't believe it. That I could do this. That I had. After the vote, I stood again. I don't need an apology. I'm not here for drama. I'm here to clean house. You have two choices. Run this company the right way, or keep lying and burn. Then I turned to him. And Tom, he looked up. I reached into my bag, pulled out one final piece of paper, and walked over to where he sat. I laid it in front of him. It was his termination notice. Signed by me. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. I walked out of that room feeling something I hadn't in a long time. Not victory. Not pride. Peace. Pure. Quiet peace. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closing slowly behind me. And I whispered, just for myself, "Let him fly, stand by now." The ground was mine again. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft click. As it descended floor by floor, I leaned back against the wall and let out the first breath I'd been holding for months. It didn't feel like triumph. Not exactly. It felt like the moment after a storm has passed when the trees are still swaying. The ground is still wet, but the air is finally still. I walked out of the building into the late afternoon light, and for a moment, everything looked sharper. The sun caught on the glass windows. A breeze lifted the edge of my jacket. I stood there, blinking, almost surprised that the world hadn't shifted on its axis, because mine had. Inside that boardroom, I had finally ended something that should have ended years ago, and he had watched it happen. He hadn't said a word after I handed him the termination notice. Not a single excuse. Not a disparity plea. That silence. That was the sound of him realizing I had become something he never imagined. Untouchable. It's a strange thing to watch a man unravel without lifting a finger. To watch him blink like he's seeing you for the very first time, really seeing you and realizing he has no power left. Not over your money. Not over your mind. Not over your name. I took the long way home. Walking 6 city blocks with no destination. Just letting it all sink in. The buildings buzzed with after-work chatter. Somewhere, a saxophonist was playing a low, sweet tune that drifted through the streets like smoke. Cars honked. Laughter spilled out from restaurants. And everything around me felt alive. I had spent so long shrinking, hiding, calculating. Now I could breathe. When I got home, there were 2 messages waiting on my phone. One from Marjorie. "They're scrambling. You did it. Sleep well." And one from an unknown number. I opened it cautiously. A single sentence. "Thank you. For everything. M. Marcus." He was okay. Relief hit me so fast. I had to sit down. I didn't realize how tightly I'd been holding that fear what might have happened to him after he stopped replying. But he was safe. And that message told me everything I needed to know. He had made it through. We both had. I curled up on the couch, still in my suit, shoes kicked off and blouse slightly wrinkled, and just stared out the window at the city lights. Somewhere below, people were living ordinary lives, picking up dry cleaning, ordering takeout, arguing about movies, and here I was, a woman who had burned down her past and walked through the ashes barefoot. I didn't feel hollow. I felt full. Not with revenge. Not with spite. With clarity. For years, he had convinced me that I was lucky to be his support system. That stepping out of the spotlight was noble. That being small was safe. But I wasn't small. I was never meant to be. I thought back to the last time I saw my reflection and didn't recognize the woman looking back. Today, that woman was gone. She had been replaced by someone stronger, sharper, and absolutely unafraid of her own shadow. Just then, a notification flashed on my phone. A news alert. Breaking major airline delays IPO amid internal investigation into flight record irregularities. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was inevitable. The truth always rises. And when it does, it doesn't ask for permission. I poured myself a glass of wine cheap. Dry, but cold, and sat on the balcony. Legs tucked under me. Hair undone. I thought I'd feel vindicated. But what I felt was something simpler, weightless. He had grounded me for so long. Now he was the one grounded. Permanently. And me, I had my wings back. All on my own. Not as someone's wife. Not as someone's sacrifice. But as myself. Whole. Unapologetic. Free. And the best part, I wasn't done yet. The sky was open. And this time, I was at the controls. The airport was quiet in that early morning, way before the crowds. Before the rush. Before the announcements filled the halls. Just the low murmur of distant voices. The occasional squeak of suitcase wheels. And the smell of strong coffee mixing with jet fuel. I stood by the private hangar entrance, dressed in simple black slacks and a cream blouse. No badge. No blazer. No mask. Just me. The real me. Behind me. The city that once tried to swallow me whole was still waking up. Ahead. A sleek private jet waited on the tarmac. Its nose tilted toward the sky, like it already knew where we were going. It wasn't mine. Not technically. But today, it would feel like it. A woman stepped down the stairs to greet me. Her uniform was crisp, her hair tucked neatly under her cap, but it was the way she stood tall, proud, solid, that made me smile. Her name was Elise. 35. Single mother. Former commercial pilot who left after being passed over for promotions one too many times. I had met her 6 months earlier through one of Marjorie's networking circles. At the time, she was flying charters and dreaming of building her own aviation company. Just needed a partner. Just needed someone to believe in her. I remembered what that felt like. So I invested. Quietly. She didn't know everything about me. Just enough to trust me. And today, she would fly me out of this city as the woman who changed her own story. "Ready?" she asked, offering her hand. I took it. As I stepped into the cabin, the hum of the engine wrapped around me like a promise. It wasn't about luxury. Orego. It was about agency. For the first time, in a very long time, I chose where I was going. We took off with the kind of smoothness that only comes when the pilot respects the sky. I looked out the window as the ground grew smaller. The office towers, the boardroom I'd once feared, the streets I used to walk with my head down, all of it fading into distance. Elise's voice came over the speaker. Calm. Confident. Cruising at 37,000 feet. Smooth ride ahead. I leaned back in the leather seat. My eyes still on the clouds. And I thought back to every moment that led here. Every morning I woke up afraid. Every night I stayed up rereading bank statements. Court rulings. Flight records. Every message I didn't send. Every tear I refused to let define me. There was a version of me that might have stayed buried in the mess. A version that would have accepted the scraps, that would have believed she wasn't enough without him, without the house, without the illusion of a perfect life. But she's not here anymore. She died the moment I walked into that boardroom and said my name out loud. And what was born in her place? A woman who doesn't ask for space? She takes it. We touched down just before noon on the coast, sunlight spilling across the runway like gold. As the wheels kissed the ground, I felt something shift inside me. Not just relief. Something deeper. Closure. Elise opened the cabin door and turned to me with a smile. Where to next? I paused. That was the question now. Wasn't it I could go anywhere? I had no one to answer to. No one cutting off my cards. No one rewriting my story. I stepped down the stairs slowly. I felt the wind move through my hair. And smiled for real this time. Anywhere I damn well please, I said. She laughed. And as we walked across the tarmac, something caught my eye, a small plaque by the hangar. Women fly too. 3 words. Simple. Strong. True. I stopped to read it. Hand brushing over the metal. I had flown under the radar for too long. Hidden in other people's shadows. Let other people's voices define mine. Not anymore. Now. I wasn't flying away from anything. I was flying toward everything. My future. My peace. My power. As I walked toward the waiting car, I turned back one last time to look at the jet. At Elise standing proudly beside it. At the wide-open sky beyond. And I whispered, not for anyone else to hear. Just for me, I'm the pilot now. And with that, I was gone. If you've made it this far, thank you for flying with me through this journey. This wasn't just a story about revenge. It was about reclaiming power. About what happens when a woman stops waiting for someone to save her and saves herself instead. I hope you felt every twist, every betrayal, and every moment of quiet strength rising back up. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated, pushed aside, told you were too much or not enough? What did you do about it, or what do you wish you'd done? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Because this isn't just my story. It's ours. And if this story moved you, share it with a friend, a sister, someone who needs a reminder that silence isn't strength. Speaking up is. Make sure you hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We have more stories coming, stories of women who've been broken, underestimated, erased, and came back louder, stronger, and smarter. Until next time, remember, you don't have to ask for a seat at the table. You build your own cockpit, and you fly.